Have you ever wondered why someone who seems so perfectly capable of love keeps everyone at arm's length? Did you ever notice how they can be charming, intelligent, even tender in moments, yet somehow unreachable when it matters most? The answer lies in understanding exactly how avoidants decide if you're safe to love. And it's far more complex and heartbreaking than you might imagine. You see, I've spent decades observing the human condition, watching how we navigate the treacherous waters of intimacy. The avoidant individual isn't cold by choice, they're strategic by necessity. Every interaction, every gesture, every word you speak is being carefully catalogued and analyzed through a lens of self-preservation that was forged in the fires of early disappointment. They're not trying to hurt you, they're trying to survive you. What you're about to discover in the next 15 minutes will fundamentally change how you understand not just avoidant attachment, but perhaps your own relationships as well. We'll explore the intricate mental processes that govern how these individuals assess emotional safety, the psychological phenomena that cloud their judgment, and most importantly, how you can navigate this complex terrain with wisdom and compassion. This isn't merely about dating someone who's emotionally unavailable. That's far too simplistic. This is about understanding a profound psychological adaptation, one that's both protective and self-defeating. The avoidant person has learned, often through painful childhood experiences, that emotional dependence equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals potential devastation. So they've developed what I call an emotional early warning system, a sophisticated set of criteria they use to determine whether you represent safety or danger. But here's the fascinating paradox. The very mechanisms they use to protect themselves often sabotage their ability to recognize genuine safety when it appears. They fall prey to cognitive biases that can make a healthy partner seem threatening while making an unhealthy one appear safe. The halo effect blinds them to red flags in people who seem familiar, while confirmation bias has them seeking evidence that even the most loving partner will eventually abandon them. Understanding this isn't just academic, it's deeply practical. Whether you're trying to love someone with avoidant tendencies, recognizing these patterns in yourself, or simply wanting to comprehend one of humanity's most common yet misunderstood attachment styles, this knowledge will serve you well. The stakes couldn't be higher, because at the heart of every avoidant individual is someone who desperately wants connection, but has learned to fear the very thing they crave most. Let me tell you about Marcus, a brilliant architect I once knew. 43 years old, successful beyond measure, with the kind of sophisticated charm that drew people to him like moths to flame. Yet he hadn't had a relationship last longer than 6 months in over a decade. Marcus would meet someone wonderful, intelligent, kind, genuinely interested in him, and for a few weeks, even months, everything would seem perfect. He'd be attentive, romantic, everything one might want in a partner. But then, inevitably, something would shift. Perhaps his partner would mention wanting to spend more time together, or suggest meeting his family, or, God forbid, say those 3 little words. Suddenly, Marcus would begin noticing flaws everywhere. The way she laughed too loudly at restaurants, how she asked too many questions about his day, the fact that she wanted to leave a toothbrush at his apartment. What had once seemed endearing now felt suffocating, manipulative even. Marcus wasn't cruel in his retreats. Avoidants rarely are. He was subtle, masterful really. He'd become busier with work, less available for calls, more distant in his responses. He'd create what I call emotional static, enough confusion and inconsistency to make his partner question themselves rather than him. And when they finally gave up and left, Marcus would feel both relieved and devastated, convinced once again that love was simply too dangerous a game to play. The truly tragic part is that Marcus had no conscious awareness of this pattern. In his mind, each relationship ended because the person wasn't right for him, because they were too needy, too demanding, too much. He couldn't see that his own fear was the architect of every ending, that his safety assessment system was fundamentally flawed. You see, Marcus was using what psychologists call familiar cues to determine safety. Having grown up with a mother who was loving but unpredictable, warm and available one day, emotionally absent the next, Marcus had learned to associate emotional inconsistency with love itself. When someone was too available, too consistent, too openly caring, his unconscious mind interpreted this as unfamiliar and therefore potentially dangerous. This is where the halo effect becomes particularly insidious. Marcus would meet someone who exhibited the familiar pattern of intermittent reinforcement, perhaps someone who was also emotionally unavailable, or who ran hot and cold, and his brain would flood with recognition. His unconscious would whisper, "This feels like love." The person's unavailability wasn't a red flag, it was a green light, because it felt like home. Meanwhile, when someone genuinely safe came along, someone consistent, emotionally available, and truly interested in building something real, Marcus's system would go into high alert. The unfamiliarity of genuine security felt like danger, and confirmation bias would kick into overdrive. His mind would become a detective, searching for evidence that this person would eventually hurt him, disappoint him, or worse, make him dependent on them. I remember the last woman Marcus dated during the time I knew him. Sarah was a pediatric nurse, steady as a rock, with the kind of quiet strength that comes from helping children heal day after day. She was patient with Marcus's initial guardedness, understanding when he needed space, supportive of his career demands. She never pushed, never demanded more than he freely offered, and somehow managed to create a sense of safety around herself that was almost tangible. For 3 months, Marcus was happier than I'd seen him in years. He'd speak of Sarah with genuine affection, describing quiet evenings they'd spent together, how easy it was to be around her, how she seemed to understand him without him having to explain himself. I began to think perhaps this time would be different. But then Sarah's grandmother died, and she needed Marcus's support in a way she never had before. Nothing dramatic. She simply asked if he could come with her to the funeral, be there as she grieved. To Sarah, this was natural. They'd been building something together, and she needed her partner during a difficult time. To Marcus, this felt like a trap closing around him. Suddenly, someone needed him, depended on him, expected him to show up emotionally when the stakes were high. Within a week, Marcus had found a dozen reasons why Sarah wasn't right for him. She was too serious about death, he decided. She didn't handle stress well. She was probably the type who would expect him to be her emotional support system for everything. By the time Sarah returned from her grandmother's funeral, Marcus had already begun his retreat, and within a month, their relationship was over. The cruelest irony is that Sarah was exactly what Marcus claimed to want, someone independent, emotionally stable, understanding of his needs. But when she revealed her own humanity, her own need for connection and support, Marcus's safety system declared her a threat. So how does this internal security assessment actually work? Think of it as an unconscious algorithm running constantly in the background of every interaction. The avoidant individual is always asking themselves 3 fundamental questions, though they're rarely aware they're doing so. Will this person need me too much? Will they try to change me or control me? And will they eventually leave me anyway? These questions are filtered through a complex web of past experiences, cognitive biases, and unconscious beliefs about love and safety. The person who passes their test isn't necessarily the healthiest choice. They're simply the choice that feels most familiar and therefore least threatening to their established sense of self. Now, let me share something that might surprise you, and here's where we move into practical territory. If you're trying to love someone with avoidant tendencies, your instinct is probably to prove your love through consistency, availability, and devotion. This feels logical, even noble, but what you're actually doing is triggering their deepest fears about engulfment and loss of autonomy. The first principle in creating genuine safety for an avoidant person is what I call secure independence. This means demonstrating that your happiness and well-being aren't contingent on them. You have your own life, your own interests, your own sources of fulfillment. When they see that you can be happy without them, it paradoxically makes them feel safer with you. Their unconscious mind relaxes slightly, thinking, this person won't collapse if I need space. They won't make me responsible for their emotional state. But here's the nuance that most people miss. This independence must be secure, not defensive. There's a world of difference between having your own life because you're a whole person and having your own life because you're protecting yourself from intimacy. Avoidant individuals are exquisitely sensitive to emotional inauthenticity. They can sense defensive independence from miles away because they're experts at it themselves. The second principle is predictable unpredictability. I know this sounds contradictory, but bear with me. Avoidant individuals need to know what to expect from you. They need the safety of predictability, but they also need to know that you won't become boring, clingy, or overly familiar. So you must be predictable in your character, reliable, trustworthy, emotionally stable, while remaining somewhat unpredictable in your choices and interests. This maintains what psychologists call optimal distance, close enough to feel connected, far enough away to feel free. This might mean having regular date nights but varying what you do. It might mean being consistently kind, but occasionally surprising them with your depth or complexity. The goal is to create familiarity without stagnation, comfort without complacency. The third principle is emotional non-violence. Avoidant individuals have often experienced emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, or punishment for their need for space. They've learned to associate emotional expression with control attempts. Therefore, you must demonstrate that your emotions, even negative ones, aren't weapons designed to change their behavior. When you're hurt, you express it without making it their responsibility to fix it. When you're angry, you communicate without threatening the relationship. When you're disappointed, you process it without making them feel guilty for being themselves. This requires tremendous emotional maturity and self-regulation. It means learning to say things like, "I felt hurt when you cancelled our plans, and I need some time to process that," rather than, "You always do this," or "Don't you care about me?" The first statement owns your emotion without making demands. The second triggers their defensive systems immediately. The fourth principle is perhaps the most challenging: patient presence. Avoidant individuals test people, often unconsciously. They pull away to see if you'll chase them. They create distance to see if you'll respect it or violate it. They share something vulnerable, then watch to see how you handle it. Your response to these tests determines whether you pass their safety assessment. Patient presence means staying emotionally available without pursuing. It means maintaining your interest without becoming clingy. When they pull away, you don't follow, but you don't punish them for it either. You simply remain consistently yourself, available when they're ready to reconnect, engaged when they're present, but not devastated when they need space. This is extraordinarily difficult because it triggers our own attachment systems. When someone we care about becomes distant, our instinct is either to pursue or to protect ourselves by becoming distant in return. Neither response creates safety for the avoidant individual. Pursuing confirms their fears about engulfment. Pulling away confirms their fears about abandonment. The fifth principle involves understanding their communication style. Avoidant individuals often communicate their needs and feelings indirectly. They might say, "I'm busy this weekend" when they mean "I need some space to miss you." They might become less responsive via text when they're feeling too close and need to regulate the distance. They might focus on your flaws when they're actually struggling with their own fears about vulnerability. Learning to read between the lines without becoming a mind reader is an art form. It means responding to their underlying emotional state rather than just their words or actions. When they say they're busy, you might respond with, "No problem, take the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." This acknowledges their need for space without making them feel guilty about it. But here's where many people make a critical error. They become so focused on accommodating the avoidant person's needs that they abandon their own. This creates an unhealthy dynamic where the avoidant person's attachment style controls the entire relationship. Remember, true safety isn't created by one person constantly adjusting to another's fears. It's created by two people learning to meet each other's needs in healthy ways. You must also maintain your own standards and boundaries. If their need for space becomes neglect, you address it. If their indirect communication becomes manipulative, you call it out gently but firmly. If their fear of vulnerability begins to erode the emotional intimacy you need, you speak up. The goal isn't to eliminate their avoidant tendencies. It's to create a relationship where both people's attachment needs can be met. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight of all. You cannot love someone into security. No amount of patience, understanding, or accommodation will magically transform an avoidant person into a secure one. What you can do is create an environment where their own healing can occur, where they can slowly learn that intimacy doesn't equal danger, that vulnerability doesn't equal abandonment. But this only works if they're willing participants in the process. They must have some awareness of their patterns and some desire to change them. Without this self-awareness and motivation, you'll find yourself in an endless cycle of accommodation and frustration, always walking on eggshells, never quite sure if you're safe to be fully yourself. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the labyrinthine world of avoidant attachment. What have we learned? That love for the avoidant individual isn't a leap of faith. It's a carefully calculated risk assessment, clouded by cognitive biases and filtered through the lens of old wounds. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to survive the terrifying possibility that they might need you. The halo effect makes them see familiar dysfunction as safety, while confirmation bias has them searching for evidence that even genuine love will eventually turn to abandonment. They live in a world where their greatest desire, deep connection, is also their greatest fear. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does offer us a pathway to compassion, both for them and for ourselves as we navigate these complex relationships. If you recognize yourself in the avoidant patterns I've described, know this: your strategies for emotional survival served you once, perhaps even saved you. But what protected you as a child may be limiting you as an adult. The courage to examine these patterns, to question whether they're still serving you, is the first step toward the deep connection your heart truly craves. If you're trying to love someone with avoidant tendencies, remember that creating safety isn't about perfect accommodation. It's about secure independence, predictable unpredictability, emotional nonviolence, patient presence, and clear communication. Most importantly, it's about maintaining your own emotional health while creating space for their growth. But perhaps the most crucial lesson is this: you cannot build lasting love on the foundation of someone else's fear. Real love requires two people willing to be vulnerable, to grow, to face their own shadows and do the work of healing. If you find yourself constantly managing someone else's attachment fears while neglecting your own needs, you're not in a relationship. You're in a therapeutic arrangement that will ultimately serve neither of you. The path forward isn't about changing anyone. It's about understanding, accepting what can and cannot be changed, and making conscious choices about the kind of love you want to create in your life. Whether you're avoidant yourself or loving someone who is, the journey towards secure attachment is possible, but it requires courage, patience, and an unwavering commitment to growth. Take what you've learned here not as a manual for fixing broken relationships, but as a map for creating healthier ones. Use this understanding to approach yourself and others with greater compassion, clearer boundaries, and a deeper appreciation for the complex dance of human attachment. Love, after all, isn't about perfect compatibility. It's about two imperfect people choosing again and again to grow together rather than apart. The fortress can become a home, but only when its builder decides that connection is worth the risk of letting down the drawbridge.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.